Welcome to Beyond the Threshold, the podcast where we explore the evolving landscape of security across schools, sports, healthcare, cities, and beyond. Every episode, we dive into the challenges and innovations that shape how we protect our communities. Today's discussion is hosted by Evolv's co-founder, Anil Chitkara.
We're here today with Jill Lamon, the Vice President of Education at Evolv Technology. Jill has a lot of experience as an educator, and then more recently, over the last few years, helping schools become more safe in a number of different areas. So I'm really pleased to have Jill today with us to talk about schools and school safety. How you doing, Jill?
Good. Thank you, Anil.
I'm excited to talk to you about what's going on in schools and how they're thinking about the school year and school safety. So the first question for you is, this is the start of the fifth school year since COVID. COVID had a very significant impact on education, our teachers, staff, and students and families. What have you seen now? Have we sort of gotten out of that COVID phase? Are we back to normal? Or is there a fundamental change in what's happening in schools?
I think we're going to be seeing the impacts of COVID in our schools across the country for many years to come, unfortunately, and in many different ways. You know, one thing we're seeing certainly is a rise in mental health issues with our students. I don't know if that can be directly linked to COVID, but we do know from many professionals that them staying home and being out of school for, in some cases, up to 2 full school years definitely impacted students' mental health and their development. But I would say what we're hearing from educators in schools across the country is that there was this extreme learning loss, this time that students were out of content and did not receive instruction. And depending on when, that actually showed itself within their personal development. For example, I have a daughter who was in kindergarten during COVID. And even though I was an English language arts teacher and have a degree in English, she is a struggling reader still and writer still years later. Why is that? Because in those fundamental years of instruction, she was not with her peers and she was not in an instructional setting. And we couldn't replicate that or didn't replicate that well enough at home. And so we're going to see that across the country. What I think we're hearing from our administrators is that, much like when COVID hit and we saw that schools do so much more than instruction. We saw the schools were actually providing food for so many students, the transportation piece, the reporting of child abuse and other instances where the school is really, the pinnacle of a society, of a community. And what's happening now is we're telling teachers and administrators, here are these kids, they're back to school, get them back to normal. And really not providing them with the right resources or tools to do that, whether that requires, a certain amount of funding, but also just time to get them caught back up.
And Jill, as you talked a little bit about the impact of COVID on students and a little bit on teachers and administrators. Today, if somebody walked into a school today, they didn't have background on COVID in the last 4 or 5 years, what would they see about students? What would they see relative to teachers? What would they see relative to administrators? What's the state of those groups in schools today?
Well, luckily for us, our educational professionals are resilient. For many decades, we've been telling them to just figure things out, and they are figuring out how to recover from that learning loss. But what they would see in our country is that the number of students in the counseling center has dramatically increased. And so you see the referrals for students for suicidal ideation, depression, and anxiety. It's really skyrocketed, again, sort of non-discriminately across the country. Again, can we link that directly to COVID? I'm not entirely positive of the research on that, but I do know that those numbers are up and that the number of vacancies, and that's not just for teaching roles, but also for counseling roles, food service, transportation professionals. Our schools are lacking individuals to fill those roles right now for a variety of reasons. And so you're seeing staffing shortages, you're seeing a lack of resources and funding in a lot of our schools, which is not new for many of our educational professionals. And you're seeing students who are in many cases behind in the content. And so how do we catch them up in the curriculum? And then at the same time, you introduce this gun violence epidemic that we're seeing across the country. And our teachers are teaching scared, many of them. There are so many different studies being done on the level of anxiety in the classroom today. I'll tell you, when I was in the classroom and I was teaching English, if I heard something in the hallway, if I heard, sort of a scuffle in the hallway between students, my immediate gut reaction was they're probably in a fist fight. body on body, wrestling, kicking, fighting. That's just where my mind went, right? And then what do I do? Do I go between them and break them up? Do I call for security? And so on. But nowadays, as I'm talking to educators across the country, I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing when I hear something in the hallway, my stomach drops because my first assumption is it's a violent incident with a weapon. And while that's not always the case, that is happening daily across the country, that we're finding guns are in schools. And, we hear a lot, Anil, about the mass casualty incidents. They get a ton of media coverage, and we hear about these big mass casualty shootings, and we should. That being said, we don't hear as often about the daily occurrences in schools where what's much more common occurs, and that is that there is an escalation of a dispute within the school. So of the last 300 or so shootings, I think it was somewhere close to 100 of them, so nearly a third of them, were just a violent escalation of a dispute. So what could have or maybe should have been a fistfight between two adolescents quickly escalated into a gun or a knife fight because a student had access to a weapon. And really, that leads to our mission here at Evolv and trying to keep those weapons out of the school so they don't have that option, when they do have some sort of dispute.
Jill, I want to shift a little bit to safety and security in schools. And I want to start with the community because the community includes families, includes educators, includes students, and includes a broader group. So how are communities thinking about safety and security in schools today?
Yeah, I think that the community is really expecting the school to sort of figure it out. And I think that that's very difficult because, like myself, many of these educational professionals do not have, specific teaching and training from their undergraduate or graduate degrees in safety and security. And so many communities and state by state are actually requiring that schools appoint a director of safety. So someone whose sole purpose and role in the district is to coordinate safety efforts. I think that's a great trend. I wish that more states were doing that, because I do think it is unfair to take someone, much like myself, who went to school for teaching and learning, and tell them, by the way, become a fast expert on, school safety and security. Instead, we're finding many different law enforcement officers or others with security experience and bringing them in to help teach them about the nuanced environment of a school. And so really what we're seeing out in the field right now in these communities is the marriage between law enforcement, security industry professionals, and educational leadership. And how do the two work together, and how do they think differently, and how do we merge those very specific and very dramatically different often perspectives on students and learning to make sure that our classrooms and our hallways are really safe for communities.
You've talked about the role of the community in schools, and particularly the role that school administrators who are not trained in safety and security but need to deal with it, need to think about it, need to consider it. What other resources do you see as valuable? So you've talked about local law enforcement as a resource, but what other resources can schools and school administrators turn to get more information about safety and security, to understand, how to think about it, what their options are, and how they might go forward?
Now, there are some excellent nonprofits that exist and some different resources that are out there. One I would want to point people to is Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, PASS. And those resources are available online. Many are meant for school administrators, but there are some for parents and for students. But what I would really urge school professionals and district professionals to do is to reach out to your parent community. This really will take all of us to make safer schools. And something that I did that was honestly scary, I was very apprehensive to do in my role as assistant superintendent in Oxford, is I actually put out a Google form, just a very, informal document. And I said, if you have any background in safety or security as a parent within my district, please let me know. And please, let me know if you're willing to serve on this parent committee. And I anticipated, usually your loudest parents are either your happiest or your angriest or your least happy, right? And I was kind of concerned about who I would get. And I was absolutely thrilled by the variety and just diversity of experiences that were in my own community that I was not aware of. And so how do we find really specific ways that are meaningful to bring those voices into the conversation? Our committee met, I believe it was bi-monthly, and we brought in law enforcement, and we had some different educational professionals, whether it was from the teacher level, the building level, and the district level. And we had some difficult conversations about safety. Some of it is very, objective. Objectively, if you do this best practice, your school will be safer. But so much about this space is subjective. And every community is different and has different values and different ideas of what their school should look like. So I think, bringing parents in is one way to assign value to the community and allow them that opportunity to really shape the school's security stance. And what does it look like to them? What type of school do they want their child in? And again, in addition to that, just to switch gears, is to have a group very similarly of staff. I think too often we make decisions about safety and security up at the top, at the district level, which is understandable. That's where the decision makers sit. But we have to include the voices of those people who are on the front lines with kids every single day. And that's to include students also. That's the third group. So we have parents and community, we have staff and including teachers and other, professionals in the building, but then also bringing in the voices of kids. They know one another better than anyone else. They typically have the safety and security information. Most of our school shootings that may have been or incidents that may have been are actually thwarted by students reporting to an adult in the building and having that adult relationship. And so how do we welcome in the voices of kids at an age-appropriate level to the conversation as well?
Jill, you've talked about the role of parents in school safety, and particularly a set of parents that have experience either in law enforcement, security, or related areas. What's the role of peer districts, peers in other areas that have gone through these considerations and decided to put security in place or not put security in place? How should school administrators use their peers in other districts to help inform them of how they might want to consider this?
I think that's a great question, Anil. And I think that maybe unlike other professions, teaching in particular and school management really requires that you stay on campus. And so very infrequently, at least in my experience, did we go on trips to other districts or to other buildings. But when we did, it was extremely eye-opening and really important work that we did. And so that would be how I would say I would want administrators and teachers to be able to go visit other schools and not just talk about what they're doing for safety and security, but see it and experience it. Okay, you guys bought an app. Let me look at your phone and let me see what the alerts look like. Okay, you guys have a mass notification system. Would you mind actually turning it on and let me hear what it sounds like? We want schools to be informed purchasers, informed buyers out there in the market. And there are so many different safety products, it's impossible to understand and know all of them. And so working with your peer districts and working with those that you trust that have similar type communities, I know no community is the same, but that have maybe a similar makeup of students, similar types of coursework and things like that, going there and actually seeing it is really an important piece of this. And I think there are some different groups that are starting to emerge to actually encourage that peer-to-peer discussion. One of those groups is Zero Now. That's another nonprofit that has some of those resources we talked about. But Zero Now is actually creating a think tank, if you will, of administrators and other types of educational professionals, as well as security professionals, to get together and really have these conversations about what are you doing, what works and what doesn't work. And it's important knowledge out there in the marketplace.
When it comes to students and administrators and staff in schools, there's a lot of different potential threats. There's a lot of things they need to be considering. How do they think about a range of measures to mitigate those threats? How can they think sort of more broadly and holistically about the broader set of considerations?
Yeah. Our schools have a range of threats to consider when they're looking at safety and security planning. And typically when you look at different types of solutions or processes and procedures, you can put them into two different buckets. One would be prevention and one would be response. And I think back when I was in my administrative role, a majority of professional development and learning actually really focused on response, which is incredibly important. What do you do in the event of an emergency? What do you do in the event of a cardiac event? What do you do, if there's some sort of bomb scare at the school or a bomb threat? I mean, all of these other, there's any number of instances that you would have to respond to in different types of threats in a school. And much of our training really focused on the response to those things. And there are plenty of different solutions and other types of processes and procedures to support those responses. I think what we're seeing now really out in schools is that the pendulum has swung the opposite way. And most of the training that I'm seeing and that I'm actually participating in is in violence prevention and in prevention of other types of threats. And that doesn't only mean maybe some of the items that we're thinking of, whether it be, technology like ours or similar types of technology, but I'm talking about even further left of boom, and that is mental health prevention tactics and different types of programming. I think that's great. I think our most successful districts have very comprehensive safety planning, and they've looked in both of those arenas. They've looked at both prevention and response, and as far back as mental health support, and have really staffed it appropriately and have included the right voices in that safety planning to make sure that it's realistic. A lot of times we do our safety planning sort of in a bubble, in isolation, and don't act it out, don't learn it on the ground. Some of the best things that we see in schools today are when they're doing drills, drills that don't harm children, but drills that are as realistic as they can be for those people who are responding to actually experience the technology that they hope to use during an issue, and experience the procedures that they would hope to use and plan to use should there be an emergency, and really put it to the test. So anyway, those districts that really are the best prepared are doing some of those best practices. They're practicing together. They're doing tabletop exercises. They're debriefing after, an exercise to say what went well and more specifically, what didn't work, and really testing technology. A lot of times we have things that we purchase that we, I'll use different apps and things like that maybe when the time comes that you really need to use it, you haven't logged in recently and your password isn't correct, for example, things like that. We have to have regular maintenance and hygiene in our safety planning.
Unfortunately, we've seen weapons, guns, and knives in our schools all too often. I want to turn to detecting and preventing those weapons from entering. In your discussions with schools and what you saw as an educator, how should a school think about weapons detection and keeping those weapons out of schools?
Yeah, certainly. So when we look at a campus is not just the doorway. A campus is from the moment a student gets on a school bus on their way into school that day for most schools, and we want to keep our children safe to and from school, during school, after school. And so safety planning for weapons and keeping weapons out of that entire arena is very difficult. Most of our schools after about 3:30 p.m. become community buildings and are open to the public. And I don't know that we want to get away from that as a society, So what are some of the ways that we can keep not only our doorways, but also our entire holistic campuses safer? And there are some technologies that we can offer. There are some technologies that we can discuss that we know others offer that work well with our technology to really expand that campus. What do I mean by that? There are some personal safety apps, and I want to talk about our EVA app. When I'm a student and I'm on the school bus or I'm walking home from school, it's really great to know that my student could have a safety app on their phone that could call for help or could contact someone if they need it. The schools are thinking about that. They're thinking about not only what kids' butts are in seats in the classroom, but all around the school building and the school day and after school. When you're a coach, for example, who's in the building at a high school, let's just say for a basketball practice, you may be the only adult in that building at that time. Let's say it's 6 to 7 at night. You may be the only adult there. And so wouldn't it be nice to have a safety app and have access to additional support and to be able to communicate with everyone that you need to? And so schools are thinking differently than just locks, for example, or alarms, right? It's becoming an even more nuanced conversation.
Weapons detection, in one sense, is very specific, but in another sense, there's a number of different types of technologies to detect weapons in different ways. There's gunshot detection, there's brandished weapons detection, there's concealed weapons detection. Those are three different technologies trying to address three different scenarios around weapons detection. Can you talk about the difference between gunshot detection, brandished weapons detection, and concealed weapons detection?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that question. I do want to point listeners to another resource that PASS is about to make available. PASS is coming out with a white paper specifically on this topic because it is difficult to understand. There are so many different types of technology, even within the weapons detection or gunshot detection space. Really there's weapons detection that can be concealed is what I'm talking about now. And that's similar to, our product Express. And that is to keep the weapon outside of the building, outside of the secure environment. And so that is typically going to be something that you walk through a device that's going to alert on different shapes or types of weapons, right? And so that's one piece of the puzzle. Then we have brandished weapons detection. Brandished meaning some amount of a weapon is visible to a camera in the building. So you have to have the appropriate cameras for that and the software to ensure that you're alerting on that. And then it's important to know, where does that alert go? Who is going to receive an alert of a brandished weapon? Is it going to go directly to law enforcement? Is it going to filter through the school? And there are some other, nuanced conversations to have there. Then we have, gunshot detection, which is an actual device that can detect when a gun is emitted, a weapon is fired. In that case, in my mind, we're pretty late in the game in emergency response because a weapon has already been used, but at least we know that and we can respond accordingly. And so, for schools, I think knowledge is power, and really in these incidents, time is the most important factor. Wouldn't we rather know about a weapon on our campus before it enters the secure environment? Hopefully keeping it out of the secure environment right there at the doorway. And so how do we extend that perimeter? How do we keep students as safe as we can from weapons, as far away from the classroom and within the classroom?
Schools have different options for different technologies, approaches they can to create a safer environment within their schools. They can put locks on the doors. They can hang cameras up. They can have social media alerting if there's concerns. They can put weapons detections up. How should schools think about where to get started and what to do next with this range of options for helping to keep their schools safer?
Absolutely. Really, it does take a comprehensive, layered approach to school safety to create an environment that's most secure. And there are so many different options to schools. I think one place to start would be looking at some of the best practices that are out there, looking at some of the widely available resources to actually assess your district and see, where are we at. I think we have different ideas, of ourselves versus actually really looking at some of the different assessment tools, or bringing in a security assessment company to really look at the district holistically and say where some of your vulnerabilities might be. So performing a vulnerability assessment is absolutely paramount. At that point, you will have identified some issues and some areas for growth within the district. And then you need to explore particular solutions or products that can address those vulnerabilities. And I would say really engaging with a number of vendors for any one product is really important. And maybe most important would be talking with current users of that product. So talking to your peer districts and actually asking them for the good, bad, and ugly about each individual safety solution is really important. I think our schools are doing their due diligence, and I think they should continue to do that before they make some of these very large safety purchases. I think what's one of the worst things that can happen is purchasing a standalone technology or other type of solution that does not integrate with the other great things that you're doing as a district. I think it's most important to really leverage your investments and make sure that all the different layers of safety and security are sort of speaking to one another to the best of our ability. It's important, the fiscal responsibility as a district leader is really paramount, very important to them. And I think that when you're spending this kind of money in a district to keep kids safe and the stakes are so high, we're talking about children's lives, it can be paralyzing. It can be difficult to make a decision. And I think that decision-making process should include demonstration of the product. It should include seeing the product or solution in a school environment in action and seeing how it works, talking with multiple different customers for testimonials, and really testing that product in your own setting or settings. If you have multiple different types of schools, what works at an elementary school might not work as well at a high school for a variety of nuanced reasons. And really inviting in those voices of safety professionals to the extent that they are available to you. Again, if you don't have them in local law enforcement and don't have those relationships, you probably do have them in your parent community. And so how do you invite in those voices of people who have done this for a living when so many of our educational professionals have not?
There are a number of former law enforcement and security professionals that are coming together and forming small consulting firms to help schools. What role can those firms play, and how can schools figure out which ones are legitimate and helpful and which ones maybe less so?
Yes, we see a lot of many times former law enforcement or military folks who really probably altruistically want to help schools, and many of them, join firms or create businesses to do that. I think that's incredible. I happen to be married to a law enforcement officer and have a lot of respect for that community. But I will say that not every law enforcement officer necessarily understands schools. It's a different type of setting. It's a different place to secure, and there are so many variables involved that are different and distinctly in a school environment. And so it's important when you look at those firms to see, do they have law enforcement or security professionals who have school specific experience? Or do they only have field experience and this is their first time working with the school? Also, do they have an educational or former educational professional on their staff? Someone who understands the instructional side. Because everything that we do in schools not only keeps kids safe, but also has to support teaching and learning. We're really there to teach and to learn. And so having someone on their staff who understands that and has a background in that is another factor to consider when you're looking at some of these security assessors. And again, I would look at their track record, ask for testimonials, ask to speak, peer to peer with individuals who have already had a security assessment and find out, what did that look like and was that meaningful? Was that information valuable to the district?
Jill, you've talked about the role of the community, of parents, of administrators and students in school safety. You've talked about some of the different layers and approaches schools can put in place. But the third piece is around the culture of safety in schools. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen some of the leading schools or the schools that have best moved forward with a culture of safety and security in schools?
Yes, we are really seeing a culture shift across the country, Anil, in our schools because we're realizing that safety is everybody's job, right? And so our school districts are taking this head on as we would expect, and our communities are supporting them. And we're seeing that, students and anonymous reporting systems, for example, are really something that's taking place in every state, I think, or almost every state across the country. We're seeing new programs develop. We're seeing students start their own programs. I don't know if you're aware of the Make Our Schools Safe program, sprouting from tragedy in Parkland, very unfortunately. But now we've got students creating clubs, safety clubs across the country. And the Make Our Schools Safe group is helping to fund them to do that. But we're seeing a shift in the culture that everyone recognizes safety is an important element of school and that it's everyone's job to keep their school safe. And that's to include students and parents as well. And it's really something that's encouraging and to see. We're also seeing many more conferences and a lot more professional development and professional learning taking place around this idea of safety and security. So where our educational professionals and administrators may have previously gone to sessions only on instruction and things of that nature, we're now seeing a lot of other sessions included in even those instructional conferences that include safety, or in the best cases, incorporate safety into teaching. And how do I teach in a safer environment? How do I teach students to think, about keeping their environment safe? It's really an interesting shift, and I'm very optimistic for our future when we have our kids involved in safety planning.
People go into education because they believe in the potential of our kids, fundamentally. They want to help those kids grow and reach as much of that potential as possible. What are some of the positive things, the optimistic things you see as you look forward for schools, for kids, for administrators, for teachers?
Yeah, what we're seeing is that students, because of technology, are more familiar with other cultures and diversity and are working better together. We're seeing team building and teamwork and innovation in our classrooms. It's really neat to hear about. It actually makes me miss the classroom a little bit, hearing about some of the great things that they're able to do now because technology has caught up sort of to this innovative spirit of children and our creativity as a country.
Our kids are our future. What gives you hope in our future?
I think that we are focusing less on test scores and specific metrics in our schools and more on our students' ability to produce and to do. And I think that's an excellent shift. I'm very optimistic as a parent of 4 kids, watching them go through elementary, and now my oldest is in middle school, and seeing just how much more advanced their learning is than even when I was in school, or even some of my cousins were in school. It's really exceptional to see. And students really, at least my kids, like school. We've made schools places where kids want to be, whether that has to do with safety or really really has to do with this sense of belonging. There's this overarching theme that everyone belongs. There's many different groups that are out there. One of them is actually WEB, W-E-B, where everyone belongs. Encouraging students to sit with someone new at lunch or to reach out to a student who looks like they, are out of place or don't have anyone or, no friends at the school, and different ways to really encourage them to be better human beings and to promote kindness. And I think that's incredible. As a parent of 4 of my own kids, and then also as someone who is very lucky to be able to go into school districts across the country on a pretty regular basis here through my work at Evolv, what I'm seeing is the true spirit of resilience in our kids. What they have been able to overcome, and I'm not just talking about COVID, I'm talking about so many other aspects of our country in the last several years. Our students are strong. Our students are going to make it and going to make the world a better place. And I think the more that we include them in our conversations and in our planning, the better off we will be. Their ideas, their creativity, their intelligence, it's really going to be a force to be reckoned with as they continue to get older and continue to join the workforce and things like that. I'm excited for the future in this country, and it's because of our kids.
I think we need to schedule another session and get into some more detail because you've shared so much of your experience across the U.S. working with different schools and administrators, teachers, parents, and students.
I'd love to come back and talk some more.
Jill, thank you for sharing your perspective, your experience with us. It's been very informative, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for the time, Anil. It's been great speaking with you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Threshold. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe and share the podcast with others who care about creating safer communities. Stay tuned for more expert insights and thought-provoking discussions in our next episode. Until then, thanks for going beyond the threshold with us. Stay safe.